Okay, welcome to part 6, where we will discuss the idea that miracles contradict science. I have bolded the parts that we will be filling out in part 6. I put this particular objection by itself, not because it is fundamentally different from the other objections, but because of its prevalence in today's culture. There are 3 objections to miracles that I will address here. The first sounds something like, miracles are violations of the laws of nature, which cannot happen. The laws of nature refer to the laws of science, like the boiling point of water or Newton's laws of motion, and the objector would say that violating them, like in the case of a miracle, is impossible. An example is the biblical account of making an axe head float on water. The objector would say that it is a violation of the law of gravity, and since those laws are inviolable, this miracle is impossible. Before we analyze this objection, I will say that naturalism, which is the idea that the natural world is all there is very hard to defend. This is because if miracles are not possible, then every supposed miracle account must be wrong. Millions of such accounts exist, and if even one of them is correct, then miracles exist. These include near-death experiences, or for that matter, any kind of supernatural experience. It includes religious accounts of miracles, such as those in the Bible, Quran, or Book of Mormon. It includes the resurrection of Jesus, which is a miracle with a particularly large amount of evidence. It includes changed lives, so people who struggle with addictions or criminal behaviors whose lives have done a complete 180, which they attribute to divine intervention. It includes apologetical arguments for miracles, such as the argument from design, which says that the existence of life is a miracle, or the arguments presented on this channel. If miracles are violations of the laws of nature and are therefore impossible, then all these accounts must be false, every single one of them. For example, if there are a million such accounts, and 999,999 of them are false or fraudulent, and only one of them is true, then miracles exist. This is why the naturalistic view is so difficult to defend. Also, if miracles are impossible, then God cannot exist. This is because if God did exist, then miracles would be possible. So to say that miracles are impossible means that one must contend with the arguments mentioned in part 4 for God's existence. Besides these initial difficulties, the objection to miracles from science, at least this first objection, makes 4 questionable assumptions. Assumption 1 is that miracles violate the laws of nature. Although this is stated in the objection, it is effectively an assumption because its truth is rarely questioned. In other words, naturalists rule out miracles in advance. They are not even considered. Miracles don't happen because they can't happen. Because of this, those who assume this are often guilty of circular reasoning, because they assume what they are trying to prove. But this assumption ignores the possibility that miracles could work hand in hand with the laws of nature, and therefore do not violate them. Such cases are often presented in the Bible. Some of these were mentioned earlier, but why not have more? For example, the book of Isaiah claims that God struck down 185,000 Assyrians in one night, thus saving Israel. Is it a violation of the laws of nature for someone to die? No, people die all the time. Of course, it's a little odd that 185,000 people died in the same place at roughly the same time, right after somebody prayed to God to deliver the Israelites, but that is a different matter. Or what about Jonah in the belly of the fish that ate him? Is it a violation of the laws of nature for a sea creature to eat a person? No, unfortunately, that is fairly common. Of course, it is a little odd that it happened as Jonah was trying to run away from God, and that he survived and that the fish just happened to puke him up close to Nineveh, but that is a different matter. There is no inherent violation of the laws of nature. Speaking of fish, what about Jesus causing the miraculous catch of fish? Is it a violation of the laws of nature for fish to swim into a net? No. Of course, it's a little odd for 153 fish to swim into the same net all at once, but that is a different matter. There is no inherent violation of the laws of nature. So we see that the laws of nature harness divine power. Just like the harness on this horse allows its power to be known, the laws of nature are used by God to make his power known. Of course, some miracle accounts do violate the laws of nature, such as with the floating axe head, or when Jesus walked on water or multiplied bread, but that is not necessarily the case. And even if those miracles that appear to contradict nature, I am sure that if one had the right equipment in the right place at the right time, they could measure scientifically observable changes and thus resolve the apparent contradiction. This was mentioned in Part 3. So, just like we saw in Part 3, the fact that this assumption is made means that Objection 5 is a straw man, for it does not address the idea that the supernatural and the natural can work hand in hand. Now one might object, saying, well, by that logic, you could say anything is a miracle. For no matter what natural event happens, you could say that God is working through it. And this is irrelevant. The fact that God theoretically could be working through the laws of nature is enough to make this assumption questionable. Besides that, the objection is simply not true. That is, if only one fish had swam into the net, we would not say that that was a miracle. But when 153 fishes do that, when Jesus said cast the net, we say it is a miracle. It is the timing and the magnitude of the natural events. It is the natural events working in supernatural ways that lets us know that a miracle was taking place. And if that still sounds a little crazy, we use this logic every day. If I look at the engine of a car, I see metal, plastic, rubber, and different fluids. There is nothing abnormal about any of these things. Most of these materials are completely natural, or at least made from natural things. So how do I know that the engine didn't occur naturally? It is by the timing, the placement, and the arrangement of these natural things that I know an engineer was present. And so it is with miracles. Or if I use a computer, the computer runs on electricity, a completely natural thing. But I know that the computer does not occur naturally because of the timing of the bursts of electricity within it, which takes the form of code. By this, I know that something outside the computer must have coded it. So it is natural events working in unnatural ways, and so it is with many miracles. But the objector oftentimes does not consider this. They assume that if a natural explanation is present, that there can't be a supernatural explanation. And the readiness with which this assumption is made is because they have already ruled out the possibility of the supernatural. And we saw the problems with that in Part 2. But even if our first assumption was safe to make, that would not be enough to justify the objector's belief. They would need to make another assumption. This assumption is that violations of the laws of nature do not happen. The problem is that we cannot know this because we have not observed every event in the universe. Mankind has observed very few of the events in the universe, let alone having written those events down for us to check. In current science, we are using the number of events that we have observed, which is infinitesimally small, to judge how the entire universe works. We don't know that what we observe on Earth is what happens in galaxies that are light years away. So, in the realm of what we do not know, there is plenty of room for miracles. And what we do not know is like an ocean compared to the drop that we do know. And of course, even if we can scientifically observe every event, that does not mean that no miracle is taking place, as was explained earlier. But one might object saying, I don't need to observe every event because the natural laws are supported by evidence. In other words, we have observed the natural laws working many times, without variation, so we can assume that they behave in the same way in other spots of the universe. And this is like aiming a pistol at a target hundreds of miles away. and assuming that the bullet could travel that far, expecting to hit it. Even the slightest deviation in the barrel of the pistol is multiplied thousands of times. And so it is with this objection. The objector takes the events that mankind has observed and expects that that is the way that the entire rest of the universe behaves. Even the slightest amount of error in what we have observed would be multiplied not thousands, but trillions of times. And I think there is some error, given the numerous accounts of miracles and the philosophical problems with trying to rule them out. The phenomenon I am describing is called extrapolation, a practice that is minimized in good science. Any attempt to say otherwise is to reduce one's work to mere speculation. And one might object, saying, well, I don't need to extrapolate because I just know that violations of nature can't happen. And this leads to our third assumption. This assumption is that violations of nature cannot happen. For miracles to be impossible, not only would violations of nature not happen in the present, that was assumption 2, they cannot have happened in the past, and they cannot happen in the future. That is assumption 3. And of course, all this assumes that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, which is not necessarily true. The justification for this assumption is usually something like, the laws of nature behave consistently in the past, therefore they will continue to behave that way in the future. Remember how in part 2 I said how this assumption is not supported by any field of science or mathematics? I copy-pasted the graphics from that part here for your reference. Feel free to listen to part 2 for a defense of this if you haven't already. So to say that violations of nature do not happen is to extrapolate one's findings across space. To say that they cannot happen is to extrapolate across time. Neither extrapolation is safe, given the limited amount of knowledge we have. And even if it was safe, extrapolating is to predict the future, which is ultimately a position of faith. So that was also explained in part 2. So the objector has 2 hurdles to jump here. But even if assumption 3 was safe to make, that would still not be enough to prove the objector's point. They must make a 4th assumption. Assumption number 4 is that the laws of nature explain everything there is. That is, even if assumptions 1 through 3 were safe to make, even if miracles violate nature and such violations both do not and cannot happen, who is to say that there isn't a realm outside the laws of nature that behaves differently? A realm that allows miracles. To say that miracles are impossible is to deny the existence of this realm. For example, if God exists, then miracles are possible. Since the objector believes they are impossible, they must also believe that God does not exist. And this doesn't just go for God, but for anything in that realm that could potentially cause a miracle. To say that this realm does not exist is to say that the laws of nature explain everything there is. And this objection was addressed in part 3. It is fallacious in 2 ways, defeats itself in 2 ways. One for every position of faith it introduces. It is incomplete because there's lots of things that science doesn't explain, and it's hypocritical because the objector exercises faith all the time. In the likely case the objector tries to revive this objection, they create the additional problems of overestimating the capabilities of science, which creates more questions than it answers, and extrapolating our limited observations, which was just described. Feel free to go to part 3 to review that if you want. So this assumption runs into the problems presented in part 3. The objector would also have to contend with the apologetical arguments and the miracle accounts that suggest otherwise. So the one who objects to miracles on the grounds given makes 4 unjustified assumptions. Since those assumptions are not safe to make them is a leap of blind faith. Therefore, objection number 5 defeats itself. It is designed to abolish faith when it really relies on blind faith to justify its assumptions. The second and third objections would say that miracles are only unlikely, but not impossible. These objections, at least, appear to consider the evidence for a miracle. However, they approach this evidence with a bias, as we will see. The first of these objections states that miracles are, by definition, unlikely events. If they weren't, if miracles like resurrections happened every day, how would we know they are miracles? There has to be a background of natural events for the miracles to contrast with, or we would not recognize them for being miracles. Since they are so uncommon, our default mode should be to not believe a miracle account when we hear one. On the surface, this seems to make sense, but let's take a deeper look. The objector thinks that miracles are unlikely because they don't happen often. What would it take to convince them that a miracle, let's call it miracle group A, or miracle A, is not unlikely? Well, one would need to show them a large body of miracles, let's call them miracles B, C, and D. Then the objector would know that miracles are not uncommon and therefore are not unlikely. But the objector would not accept this body of miracles as actually being miracles, because their idea that miracles are unlikely still hasn't been removed. So they would demand even more miracles, let's call them miracles E, F, and G, to establish that miracles B, C, and D are not unlikely. And the cycle would repeat itself. The objector would continually demand more miracles to show that our first miracle is not unlikely. So there is no way for this objection to be proven false, even if it was false. You cannot logically reason with bias. This makes this objection non-falsifiable. Of course, the objector could say that it is only the claims of miracles that they need. One only needs to show them miracle claims for them to believe that miracles are not unlikely. But these claims exist in abundance. The sheer number of them would be more than enough to establish the plausibility of miracles. So this is not a way out. This objection, supposedly made from science, is not very scientific. So this objection is a poorly designed experiment. It also assumes that just because something is uncommon means that it is unlikely. Uncommon deals with what has already passed. Unlikely deals with probability and applies to the future. So making the jump from uncommon to unlikely requires one to assume that the future will behave like the past. But there is no way to do this in the naturalistic worldview. You cannot make inferences. Remember the 5 subjects of science that I cited earlier, how each of them says, in its own unique way, that you cannot assume this in a scientific manner. So the objector contradicts himself. If the objector cannot make inferences when dealing with natural events, then how much more would that be the case when they are dealing with supernatural events like miracles? To say that miracles will occur in the same frequency in the future as they have in the past assumes that whatever causes the miracle will behave in a constant manner. This is not a safe assumption. In the Bible, the frequency with which God performed miracles is highly variable. The miracles are generally restricted to a few periods and are generally less frequent elsewhere. The objector has not considered that who they are experimenting on just might not play by their rules. So it is not safe to assume the future from the past, even with natural events, let alone supernatural ones. The third problem is perhaps the most obvious one, and is that not all proposed miracle accounts are uncommon. For example, the transcendental argument in Christian apologetics proposes that the laws of nature or of logic need divine intervention to function. So every time the law of gravity is in action, or every time we use logic in our reasoning, we are witnessing a miracle. Another example is the idea of irreducible complexity, which states that many biological systems are too complex to have formed randomly. Therefore, they need a designer. So every time one of these systems forms, such as in embryonic development, a miracle takes place. Or some Christians would say that every time a person comes to the Christian faith, that is a miracle, only possible through God's intervention. Now, my point is not to say that these are actually miracles, only that not all proposed miracles are uncommon. The objector implies that if resurrections happened every day, that we would view them as commonplace, and therefore not miraculous. I disagree. To have a person come back from the dead for the millionth time defies the laws of nature just as much as it would the first time. And I think that we are smart enough to see that. We wouldn't assume that resurrections are explained naturally just because they are commonplace, just like we don't assume the laws of nature or irreducibly complex systems are natural because they are commonplace. It is interesting that the Bible says that one day every person will be physically resurrected, and that they will live in that state for eternity. In other words, resurrections will become commonplace. But I don't imagine that anyone will be standing there wondering if the resurrections happened naturally. The third objection follows the same logic, but it takes a slightly different approach. It, like the second one, comes from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. He proposed the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In other words, if I said the sun is rising, I would not have to give as much evidence for that claim as if I said, there is a T-Rex in my backyard doing jumping jacks, or a miracle has happened. So, we should be naturally inclined to not believe in miracles. Now, this objection is just our second objection reworded. Miracles are a type of extraordinary event, so miracles require extraordinary evidence. And the objector very likely thinks that miracles are unlikely, or else they wouldn't demand extraordinary evidence for them. So this is a close variation of saying miracles are by definition unlikely events. Because of this, most of the rebuttals given for objection number 2 also apply here. That is, not all proposed miracles are extraordinary. And if they aren't extraordinary, then they don't require extraordinary evidence. Also, making the jump from extraordinary to unlikely runs into the problem of induction, and is especially not safe when you're dealing with the supernatural. But there are some rebuttals that are unique to this objection, which are detailed here. I would argue that all claims require the same amount of evidence. The objector says that if I observed the sun rising, and it was the first time the sun rose, I would need to give an extraordinary amount of evidence, for the sun rising is an extraordinary claim. However, if I observed the sun rising 1,000 times in a row, then I would need to give less evidence than I gave for the first time it rose, for that claim has now become ordinary. But does the amount of evidence really change? Let's say the sun had risen 1,000 times in a row and someone still didn't believe me. How would I prove this to them? Well, I would point out the brightness of the day and maybe take them outside so they can feel the sun's heat. That evidence is no different from the evidence I would use to prove that the sun rose any other day. The evidence is sufficient, regardless of the time. Sure, the first time the sun rose, I might be curious about some of the details about it, but I wouldn't doubt the evidence simply because it's not extraordinary enough. And maybe we are more likely to assume, after the 1,000th time, that the evidence remains, so we don't check it. But that is not the same as there being less evidence. As the ghost of Jacob Marley in A Christmas Carol says to a doubtful Ebenezer Scrooge, "What evidence would you have me give you besides that of your own senses?" For this reason, this claim is an extraordinary claim. Why should I believe that I need to give more evidence for something extraordinary? Because I was under the impression that in science, when something new is discovered, the burden of proof is no more or no less than it is for anything else. Of course, you could say that that isn't the case if the event you are studying is improbable, but that claim can't be made about miracles. Good scientists are unbiased and follow the evidence where it leads. So this claim is not intuitive, especially to a scientist. If the claim is extraordinary, then by its own logic, it needs extraordinary evidence, which is rarely provided. It is not vigorously defended as its own logic demands. It is often assumed. So I am in the right for being skeptical of it. Fourthly, and most importantly, this claim rules out extraordinary events, miracles included. How would one prove to the objector that an extraordinary event like a miracle has happened? Well, you would give them an extraordinary amount of evidence. But the very existence of this amount of evidence is an extraordinary claim. That is, according to the objector, it is ordinary for ordinary amounts of evidence to exist, meaning that it must be extraordinary for an extraordinary amount of evidence to exist. But if what they are asking for is an extraordinary event, then that would require its own body of extraordinary evidence. But they would doubt that because that is an extraordinary claim, and the cycle repeats itself. So, one could never show the objector that an extraordinary event has happened. Their view is restricted to belief only in what they deem as ordinary. There can be no new discoveries, for such discoveries would be extraordinary. Under this thinking, science cannot progress. But you will notice that some who make this objection are excellent scientists, who are perfectly open-minded to new scientific discoveries. And I don't see the skeptics who promote this idea demanding extraordinary amounts of evidence for their own claim the first time they hear it. It is often accepted at face value, because it makes intuitive sense to them. So why is it that the objectors are open to those extraordinary claims, but not to the extraordinary claims of miracles? I think it has to do with what, or rather who, might be behind the miracle. Why else would this double standard exist? So despite appearing to be more open-minded than our first objection, this objection is very often just another way to rule out miracles, according to one's bias. This is more for your information, but there are many variations of this objection. You might hear, skepticism should be the default mode of thinking, or miracles are scientifically unlikely. The objection is quite popular. So in summary of part 6, we discussed the idea that miracles contradict science, with specific regard to the first objection, which is that miracles violate the natural laws and are therefore impossible. This objection is statistically unlikely, given the sheer number of miracle accounts. Also, it implicitly claims that God does not exist, something that the objector may not be ready to defend. Besides this, it makes at least 4 unjustified assumptions. These are that miracles violate the laws of nature, that such violations both do not and cannot happen, and that no realm outside of the laws of nature exists. The next objection said that miracles are not impossible, just unlikely. The first variation of this stated that miracles are, by definition, unlikely events. This proposes a non-falsifiable experiment, in which the objector continually demands more and more miracles to make the belief in the first miracle plausible. It also suffers from the problem of induction, which the objector cannot justify naturalistically. And making inductions is especially unsafe when dealing with the supernatural. Lastly, not all miracle accounts are uncommon. The last objection was that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It is very similar to our second objection, and as such, suffers from many of the same problems. Secondly, all claims, unless you know that a claim is improbable, require the same amount of evidence. To say otherwise is to be biased. Thirdly, this claim is extraordinary. So, by its logic, I am right to demand an extraordinary amount of evidence for it. This is rarely, if ever, given. Fourthly, this claim rules out extraordinary events, its own claim included. This makes it unfriendly to new discoveries in science. So there are 5 problems with this third objection, 2 being inherited from the second, and 3 being unique to the third objection. As it is, the scientific arguments against miracles are statistically unlikely to be true, given the sheer number of miracle accounts, and they are, for the most part, just ways for people to rule out miracles in advance, so they don't have to consider the evidence, which of course is biased. In Part 7, I will summarize Parts 1 through 6 and discuss their implications. See you there.